Today I'm doing a job that doesn't usually receive the attention it deserves in anyone's home garage. We're going to fondle a few parts and tools, give them all a quick "how you doing," and then jump right into installing a brand new set of valve springs. Manufacturing tolerances and variations in the machining of all of the valve train parts can cause anomalies in the height of the valve springs once they're all assembled. And these variations can lead to some pretty ugly problems. People go through great lengths to balance their rotating assembly in the block, and this is the equivalence of doing the exact same thing to the cylinder head. So in this video, I'm going to show you what these tools do and how I use them. These 321 blocks are really for calibration of depth micrometers, but they also provide a machined straight edge that works great with my stem height gauge. They're called 321 blocks because depending on which side you set them on, one side is 3 inches, one is 2 inches, and one is 1. I do have a depth mic and maybe we'll play with it later. Most people use it for this job, but because of the kind of stem height gauge that I'm using, I won't need it for most of this work. Before you begin, your valves need to already be fitted and sealing against the valve seats. That's the stubborn, unchangeable variable. Know that every single part that you stack on top of each valve after that will affect your spring installed height. Keep it all together. Each valve assembly consists of a spring seat, a retainer, and a set of keepers. The keepers are half-round, conically shaped, tapered, hardened steel things that fit into the groove on the tip of the valve, and they rely on the spring pressure to lock them into place. It's what you call an interference fit. One set of keepers isn't going to fit the retainer and valve the same way that another set will, and this will affect where the retainer lines up on the valve stem. So basically, all of these parts have a thickness, even the keepers. The bottom of the retainer has a recessed flange where the top of the spring sits. That's essentially your upper spring seat. The protruding portion below it should fit snugly inside of each spring to center it, but this gap complicates measurements for many people. All of these parts need to be measured individually and paired up for the best fit. The more evenly you're able to balance how they all fit, the smoother and longer your valve train will operate. There's 3 measurements that we need to focus on to see where we're at: valve stem height, spring seat thickness, and retainer tip height. Only 3 measurements? Well, that's easy. Yeah, times 16. Okay, so maybe it's 48 measurements, and maybe we're only just getting started. Judge me. Start with the stubborn, unchangeable variable first. To measure valve stem height, it's recommended that you use a valve stem height gauge, but there are other ways. I'm going to use these 321 blocks to set the 0 point on this Goodson valve stem height gauge. This tool remarkably has a 2-inch range, graduated in thousandths of an inch, so I'm just going to put this unit together with the jig that fits my valve seats and zero it on a flat surface. This Goodson unit keeps me from zeroing a tool and then measuring a tool with another tool. Using it is simple. You place the probe tip on the top of the valve stem and fully insert the gauge so that the jig rests squarely on the spring seat. You'll know exactly when you've got it right because if you rotate the gauge, the needle won't move at all. That's how you know it's good. I've actually already measured these exhaust valves once before, and you can't do the whole job facing the gauge in one direction so that I can show you, because it interferes with the camshafts. It's a big gauge. It's a very tight fit, so I'm just going to blaze through these, checking my previous measurements for now. And there you have it. Stem heights for the exhaust valves. Same thing has to be done on the intake valves too, so I recheck my 0 point, ignore the parallax error right here from the camera angle, it's actually right, and like I said, same thing. I'm holding each valve firmly against the valve seat to ensure that the spring that belongs to the stem height gauge won't push the valve open. Because it totally can, be aware of that. Write each number down, and what you see in these results is that even a factory valve train that's never been cut with a brand new quality set of valves and straight guides produces a variation in stem height of 1/100th of an inch, which is a little over 2.5 of a millimeter. Depending on your goals, this right here could be enough to cause a problem with seat pressures all by itself, except that I'm going to demonstrate here how everyone can actually use this to their advantage. Next, we'll do the easy ones, spring seats. Other than mine being shrink-wrapped into an ice cube tray with all the other associated parts from the old Gallant head, and speaking of which, might as well get those other parts too. I need the keepers, there's even a set of shims in here that I plan to measure. But anyway, other than having to dig all this out, mine are totally uncomplicated. Some have an outer lip making them harder to measure, but mine don't. I gave all of it a quick wipe down, and now that I've dug the shims out, I really can't resist measuring them any longer. Looks like all 16 of them are 30 thousandths. There's no way anyone cut 30 thousandths off the valve seats from the head these parts came from. There's only 8 thou there to cut, so odd shim choice. When you measure the seats, you'd measure from where the spring rests to the bottom of the seat in several places around its circumference, using the tips of your calipers aimed at the center of the part. Make sure they're all the same measurement and write it down. Do this for all your spring seats. For the severely retentive, number all 16 and keep them in order. I'm a little bit lazy. I cheated. I made different piles for different sizes, and I'm just going to put them where I think each one of them needs to be in the seat pockets and the head, because mine are all really close. They all measure between 40 and 42 thousandths. There was only one of them that was 39 in the pool. This is just my way of keeping them organized for now. This is where things get fun, measuring retainer tip height. Of course, if we need to measure this, I'm going to need to take all the valves out of the head first. I numbered these things in the last video to make them really hard to mix up. I just put them back in the boxes they came in. Next, I get all the springs and the retainers out of their packaging. Cool, because I love opening new stuff. One of the things I like about Kigley beehives is how the tapered springs and their smaller diameter retainers help focus all of their lifting forces closer to the center of the valve than the factory spring does. That actually helps, reduce the potential for damaging valve guides because it holds the valve more upright in all of its movements. It's also much lighter with the titanium retainers, but I just bought the standard steel ones because my power and rev limit goals don't require that on this build. Retainer tip height is usually a combination of measurements because of the shapes of the parts, and that statement is plural because the retainer, valve, and keepers all play a factor in the result. How they fit together suddenly matters in the math. You've got the thickness of the retainer, the depth of the step, the differences in the keeper tolerances, and even possible differences in the overall length of the valve if there's ever been a valve job performed on it. Add to that, the flat surfaces that you need to measure are offset, making it impossible to fit your calipers simultaneously on both surfaces to take an accurate measurement. I can show you the complicated version of doing these measurements, but... Yo dog, I heard you like vices, so we put a vice in your vice. Oh no, Jafro, what you doing? Yes, I cleaned that up with a flat file, and now I've got offset calipers for measuring retainer tip height. Under 20 bucks at Harbor Freight. I had to share this little trick I learned from Boosted Beaver's build thread on DSM tuners. And he's on YouTube too, The only thing you have to be careful about is keeping the valve and the caliper square with one another, and keeping the tip of the caliper centered and square on the tip of the valve. You get a feel for it, but you'll be able to get a better eyeball on what you're doing to develop that feel if you backlight it. It makes it easier to see if you're square. Write each one of them down and keep them in order. You can see I've got a variation in retainer tip heights of 15 thousandths of an inch. Now let's do the intake valves, same exact thing. You thought I was going to make you do all that math, didn't you? Yeah, well this fits the price, quality, speed, pick 2 example. It simply adds easy to the mix. If you want other measurements explained by a machinist, look up my Cylinder Head 203 video. That's what happens there. The only reason I hammer points about accuracy in my video is simply to help people be mindful about what's in their hands and why they're doing it, how they're doing it. The accuracy range of cheap calipers is fine for this job because you'd otherwise have to take 3 separate measurements to get your retainer tip height with the exact same inaccurate calipers and then manually do the math and add all that and mux it together. More than tripling your margin of error because you made yourself a part of the circuit. I like this trick, and I'll use it for a lifetime, or at least until the batteries die. Now with all these numbers, we're actually able to determine what the cylinder head's available spring install height is for every single valve. I'm just going to transfer these numbers into a spreadsheet now because the calculation to do this is extremely simple. It's valve tip height minus spring seat thickness minus retainer tip height. I didn't feel like boring you with a whole lot of simple math, so I'll let the spreadsheet do it for me. In fact, creating the spreadsheet is so boring that suddenly I'm back in the garage with all the valves back out in front of me again, which I have checked, and I have double checked, and I have triple checked, made sure I had all the numbers right. This evolved a little bit. I actually kept working on this database. It's the same database. I've just basically glorified it with some color-coded columns, some automatic calculations, and everything here on the top row that's in gray is the stuff that you have to fill in yourself, and everything that's in these sort of orangey-looking cells is stuff it calculates for you. And I'll explain what all these are. High-low is basically, well, let's start with average. Here on row 12 and on row 22 we've got an average field, and it tells me what the average is among these 8 measurements. In this case this is valve stem height. It gives me the low, represented by a negative number and a high represented by a positive number based off of the average. Okay, so this is 4 less than average and 4 greater than average. That's all there is to this column. That's what the calculation up here says. And you can see I've multiplied it by 1,000 so that it gives me the results in whole thousandths rather than thousandth decimal. So high-low is thousandths. Alright, spring seat thickness, didn't do anything special there. This is just pretty much a placeholder. These are all used in the calculation to figure out real spring installed height. That's an important thing we just talked about. Retainer tip height, same sort of deal. All of these measurements are what we took with the calipers after we cut them. And you can see that I've got a range here of negative 8 thousandths to positive 3 thousandths. So there's my low to high. That's a range of about 12 thousandths of variation. And you know, here, right here, we've got, 8 thousandths variation. And by the end, when all the math is done, we have 17 thousandths variation. You can see how reshuffling some of these values will actually wind up giving you, a better result. It's sort of like a puzzle at Cracker Barrel, this little brain teaser thing. So anyway, free height. This is for springs. If you look up here at the top, I've got them labeled. These are valve measurements. These are spring measurements. This is the fit, and all of these are calculations. This just kind of gives you results to chew on after you finish filling in all of the other fields that you have to fill in. And everything is redundant in the top column for the intake as it is for the exhaust. Down here on the bottom, I've got cam info where I've added fields for intake lift and exhaust lift. This is used in the calculations over here under fit for the headroom value. Now what this is, basically you take the height at a given spring pressure, you subtract the minimum spring height from it, and you subtract the lift from it. And by doing that, you come up with how much room you've got until spring bind, because that's what minimum spring height is. Kegley recommends that you don't install the springs any smaller than 9/10 of an inch. They get into spring bind very shortly after that, but this is the minimum recommended height that you should ever use. So I entered that into the value, and that gives me the information for how much headroom is left when I'm finished. Now, if I run out of headroom and I get into spring bind, well then these values turn negative and they flip red like they are right now. So that tells me that I would have to go get machining or a different valve spring in order to make that work. And I've put notes for all of this in this database thing, so I can use it again someday later down the road and know what the heck I'm talking about. The correction values are exactly what they sound like. Basically, this tells you what the difference is between your real spring installed height and the spring height at whatever given pressure that we wind up measuring here in just a minute. So anyway, rather than shuffle any of these things around to save time and effort, let's measure the springs first and fill out all the rest of these values, how our springs are behaving, and that'll give us a better idea of where to put things in the long run. And we'll be working out of this database because the whiteboard's just too hard to do the math on. Now I know this is the tool that everybody really wants to see get used here. This is a Proform valve spring load tester, and basically it measures the height and the spring load of your valve springs. It can handle a spring up to 4 inches and up to 1,000 pounds. When you move this thing, it automatically turns on the micrometer that does the measuring portion of this process. So naturally it arrives on your doorstep with the batteries installed, dead batteries installed. I'd have to say the build quality on this unit is about 9 out of 10. It's got little cosmetic things like, how well the sticker's stuck down when you put a screw through it and twist it a little bit down here in the corner, and you can't see that because it's behind the clamp anyway, but it's a good unit. It's going to serve my purposes. The first thing you have to do is zero it, and then after you get it zeroed, both the scale and the micrometer, you can go to town and measure all your valve springs, and it'll give you however much pressure they're making at whatever height you have them squished at. Calibration goes like this. Basically, you screw the thing all the way down. Oh, I got to turn the scale on first. And also, it has a nice little feature where if you hit the mode button and zero at the same time, the on button, let's see if I can hit them together. There we go. Yeah, backlighted. That one's not backlighted, but that one is. Pretty cool. So, anywho, the way this works, if I can get you in here a little closer. The way this works is you basically turn the thing down until you're at 1 pound. And right as you creep up on 1 pound, now it happens quick, so after you touch 1, it jumps up fast. But you just creep up on your 0 point. When you get 1 pound, you zero that, and it remembers the 0 point even when it cuts off. So anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through the measurements for each of these valve springs and record them in the spreadsheet. Let's start with number 1, and we'll just fill this in on the intake side. You line up your valve spring in the very center. You crank it down just like we did with the calibration. When you hit 1 pound, you stop. And there is your free height measurement, 1.776. Now we squish the valve spring down until we hit 83 pounds. 83 pounds is what Kelford recommends for the seat pressure on the TX264s. So 83 pounds is where we're going to take our first point of reference, but I'm going to measure a few other points in between just to see how that affects things in case we have to change the seat pressure around for our needs. So here we are creeping up on 83, and as soon as it flips to 83, we've got 1.480. Put that in the database, 1.480. And now, creep up on 86. We have 1.468. And now we go for 88 pounds. We have 1.461. Now here's where we start to have some fun. I'm going to crank this down until we get to 1.030. And we have 225 pounds, so roughly 225 pounds of seat pressure when the valves are fully opened. Let's go for 900. You can see at their bind setting, they're at roughly 280 pounds. So at their minimum installed height, they're roughly 280 pound springs. Record your measurements, move on, do the next one just like this one. And here we go, adding another 96 measurements to our first 48. I told you we were just getting started. The free height, 1.03 inch, and minimum install height measurements I took for each spring aren't actually used in any of the calculations. They're just for my own personal reference and to help me get to know each spring a little bit better. So 32 of these measurements aren't really necessary. But as I fill in this data, you can see how the correction and headroom cells fill themselves in. Alright, so I got all the stuff out now. And now that we're back here again with all these numbers, I'm just going to basically figure out which ones are the big springs, which ones are the big retainers, which ones are the big spring seats. I'm going to shuffle all this stuff around in order to be able to make all these numbers kind of jive and work out. Because there's going to be a range of values that you get for everything, and you can see that here. So looking at it at first glance, the real spring installed height, there's a considerable difference of about 40 thousandths of an inch between these two sets of valves. So naturally, what would be the smart thing in order to preserve your spring height and try to run as low of a pressure as you can, you take all your small springs and you put them on the exhaust. So I guess right out of the box, I'm going to decide that I'm going to run this thing at 86 pounds of seat pressure. So I'm going to take all of the small values. And you can see here I've already highlighted the big ones in red. These are all going to end up on the top, and these are all going to end up on the bottom. So I got to shuffle springs in order to really get a good perception of where that's at. Now another place where I can make up a little bit is in the retainer tip heights. You can see that I have a low here of 379 thousandths. Then I've got a high times multiples of 390s. So I got several of the big ones. And down here I've got a range of about 9 thousandths. Really only 2 of them that are substantially large, a few of them that are positive. So we can swap those things around too to move around the correction values so that we can get some standard sized shims. That's the goal here. So right off the bat, I think what I want to do is I want to take all of the retainers that are small. I think this is what I'm going to do first. I'm going to take the small retainers here and I'm going to move them down to the bottom. I'm going to take the big retainers, move them up to the top. This is in an effort to take these averages. You see right here, they're only 2 thousandths apart. By taking all the small ones and putting them together, and taking the big ones and putting them together, I'm just moving a larger gap between these two averages. So there's going to be a bigger step there. You'll see when it's finished here. So number 1 intake is 383. And I'm going to go ahead and just pop that one off. And which one can I put in its place? I'm going to take number 1 on the exhaust, swap them, check them. Actually got 378.5, which is pretty cool. That means not only did I move it, but I actually gained 5/10. But we know that may not be accurate. I'm just going to leave it the way it's notated. So we just moved number 383 here. So it's now 379. And we'll check number 1 intake again. I'll check my 0. That's got to be it. That's it right there. That's where that half thou is. 398. You see I've just corrected these values. Number 1 is 398. This one is now, I believe, 379. We're going to change that back to green because, well, it's fixed. Next one's got number 2 on the intake. And number 2 on the exhaust. So we got 380 now. Exhaust, 380. Let's check the intake. Got a solid 394. And that is now red. We got this tiny little guy here on intake number 4. We got this big old boy on number 6. It appears as though all the way around I have a 373. So this is what I was talking about with spreading out the averages. By putting all of the small retainers on the exhaust valves and putting all of the big ones, well, I'm not even finished. I got one left. Apologize, terrible. There, let's just go ahead and do that real quick and put that value in. And I'll finish that point. You can already see it coming. You know what I'm about to say. Really? Did I do that perfect the first time? I did. Alright, number 4 is 389. Now you'll see that dramatic difference. With all the big retainers on top and all the small retainers on the bottom, I've now got a spread of 10 thousandths between the intake and the exhaust valve. So I've shaved 10 thousandths of the difference off of the installed spring height requirements. It made it look as though, you know, some of these numbers are viable, and you see one of them right here is extremely viable. I might have to shuffle some stuff around further, and I will. But I think what I want to do next is shift the springs first before I make any of those decisions. So what I'm going to do is at 86 pounds, I'm going to take all of the heaviest springs, do the exact same thing with the intake side. I'm going to put the big heavy springs on the intake side and the lighter springs on the exhaust.
And right about there, that's the point where you don't need to hear me babble for hours about every little thing I was working on. You get it. I just wanted you to see a few get done so that you could see how easy this really is. Time's your only expense here. By having separated the springs and retainers into large and small groups and assigning them accordingly to the tall and short sets of valves, we basically cut our struggles in half. Once sorted, I shuffled the parts among each set of valves to get as close as I can to my goals, and then after that, going back and swapping retainers around again for the stubborn ones. The spreadsheet I made easily reveals whatever I need to change because it's updating the math for me as I go along. What you see me doing, I'm copying the group of parts that I'm moving, pasting them below the spreadsheet, and making my changes there. Then I move the parts and paste them back into the cells above once that's done. That way I can easily stay in sync with both the spreadsheet and my parts. I'm also trying not to break anything in the spreadsheet, only copying the white cells that don't contain calculations, because Excel does some really funky stuff if you paste a calculation over top of another calculation. If it came from a different cell, it doesn't care if it's the same calculation. Each time I move a group of parts, I get closer. As some of them zero out, it gets even easier for me to see what I have left to work with. You get a lot more height adjustment from swapping springs to a different valve tip height or shuffling retainers around and keepers than you will with shuffling seats. So essentially what I'm doing is just exploiting one variation from one part out of spec equally with another out of spec combination of parts on another valve. I use the correction value fields to see how close I am and to try to get those values either zeroed out or to a positive number divisible by 15 thousandths, because those are the standard size shims that I'm able to buy. They come in increments of 15 thousandths, they just do. With shims, you've got reverse Price is Right rules. Closest install height to the seat pressure without going under wins. If you get within 10% above the minimum seat pressure and still have headroom before spring bind, well, you know, it's perfectly acceptable to do that. So 15 thousandths is all the forgiveness you get with shims, and the process that you see me doing right here is exactly why. But if perfection is your goal, then there's even more that you can do after you've done your best job shuffling, and I'll show you. Your spring seat, block of wood. I should have said your spare spring seat, because now you've pretty much destroyed it. I did that to put a groove in the wood to hold a different seat still and show you this trick. So anyway, take your die grinder with a coarse roll-lock sanding disc, flat against it, and sand the bottom of the seat down. You're sanding steel, so it's slow going, and the seat gets super hot, which is the other reason I made this jig. Pro tip, I found a use for your 18mm 12-point socket. The seat fits perfectly inside of it. Saves you from crushing it with a hammer. I may have done this on my anti-fatigue mat already, a little too melty, but the goal is to make the seat slightly thinner and sneak up on the correction value that you need without burning yourself. I wouldn't go more than 10 thousandths smaller than the factory seat, but you should still be able to shuffle everything else around and get well within that range prior to ever having to resort to something like this, if at all. But I'm going to do it on a few valves, just cause. While some will insist this is a completely unnecessary level of detail to achieve on this job, and provide sound reasoning for why it's unnecessary, I assure you there's still a performance benefit for doing it. I told you I'd show you how to set up the smoothest running valve train possible, and this would be how you'd do that. Each time a cam lobe lifts a valve, it transfers its spring load to the camshaft. This creates a torsional vibration in that camshaft. If you've got your spring set at different loads, it's playing a symphony of different beats, even though the frequency is a constant. Your valve train is connected to the timing belt, is connected to the crankshaft, is connected to your engine accessories, or connected to your cam angle sensor, or connected to the ECU. You get it? So the more time you take to balance out your spring loads and the less harmonic and torsional vibrations you introduce to all those parts, the better. Especially for that rubber ring in the middle of your stock crank damper pulley. Think I'm kidding. So here we are after a considerable amount of part swapping. I'm getting really happy with the results, and there's only a tiny little bit left for me to do.
Whittling away at these, we're now starting to see a lot at or near zero. Intake correction values hovering around 30 thousandths too. These are all positive developments. Only a few left to go, and the ones that are off by only one can usually be solved by swapping spring seats. It looks to me like we can swap exhaust number 4 and intake number 8, because one's over a thousandth and one's under by a thousandth. No brainer. Just swap out the values for the seats, and now with those two updated, 2 more valves are zeroed out. I also pulled the lone 39 thousandth seat out earlier when I ground a custom seat, and it looks like putting it on an exhaust number 7 will zero that one out too. I like the easy ones. Also, intake number 1's got a 40 on it, and I've got plenty of spare 41s. More easy ones. It helps to have spare parts. We've got 11 out of 16 valves either zeroed or dead on 30 thousandths now. I'm all out of 42s in my spares now that I only have that one on intake number 2 left, so I have to get creative. I see that one that's off by 8 thousandths has a 42 on it. I think I'm going to house that and put it on intake number 2 and then swap retainers around to fix intakes number 3 and 4 if I can. You may have picked up on how I'm measuring and checking the parts as I go to ensure that I'm moving the correct parts and that my measurements are correct. I'm constantly checking myself as I go, and it's likely I'll blank this spreadsheet when I'm done and do it all again to check my work. I won't make you watch that. Put the 42 on intake number 2, and now I've only got 4 left. I'm going to go ahead and swap these retainers around and see where that puts us. The spreadsheet showed a difference of 6, and it had 1 over and 1 3 under. I'm hoping this will cut it. Swap retainers. Something doesn't feel right this time though. I think I screwed something up, so I was extra careful with my measurements again. Sure enough, one's still 395, and for intake number 4, 392. I did screw something up. I mixed up the keepers with different retainers. I'm also not interested in figuring out which ones. I've got them one under and one over now. This is why I measure the things that I'm moving. The seats are pretty far apart, so I can't swap them. I hope I can find another 42. Maybe I overlooked one. I got so many cylinder heads laying around that I should be able to produce one for number 3, but it looks like I still need another custom seat. I'll just find one that's suitable for this first. Here's one measuring 39.5. I don't have to go far. I've just got to produce a 37 with it. And there you go. Just like that, we're done with the intake side. Now all I've got left is the 2 bangers on the exhaust. We'll start by swapping those springs. That was easy. Now for the hard part. Moving the spring loads around. I got 5 measurements that belong to each spring. This process helped me discover an issue with how Excel works, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but what we had here was one valve 10 thousandths too tall for the spring, and one that's 8 thousandths too short. There's also a variation of 2 thousandths on valve tip height, and swapping the springs alone didn't fix it. So I get to swap the retainers too. So on these two, all the math had to move. They're closer, but they're both over, which means that I need bigger seats than I've got. I dug through my parts shelf and found another 42. That easily solves exhaust number 6, but once again, I've got to replace a 36 with another 37. It just doesn't like my 36s. Rejection. Prefers 37s. Who knew? This is nuts. I don't think I've ever had a cylinder head this on point before, and now that I have these tools in my arsenal, I'll be able to do it again and again. If I only had one project car, I probably wouldn't have done this myself. It would have been cheaper to pay someone to do it for me. But would they have done all this? I can't answer that, because I did this myself instead. Here's the after. The reason this is so ridiculous is that most people will aim for the within 10% tighter than spec and call it a day. Or they'd let a few of them slide. I did it this way to demonstrate that it can be done. All the performance benefits are really going to come from my cam selection and the work I did sealing up the valves. This just helps the engine run smoother, and hopefully for longer. My seat pressure is only 3.61% higher than the minimum seat pressure spec, but on every single valve and exactly the same. And that's intentional because I plan to turn the wick up higher than stock boost pressure on this thing. We're 3 pounds higher than Kelford's minimum seat pressure recommendation, 4 pounds higher than the factory valve springs and cams, and only 1 pound higher than Kigley's rating at installed height. You can see how the headroom exhibits loads of extra clearance, safely far away from spring bind. Even though nearly every single part that we measured was unique in its own special way, the correction value column proves that amidst all of this chaos, that this is what perfection looks like. Everything's still totally out of spec, just in all the right places for this. So, it's normal. And I'll sign off on this one too. For those of you fascinated by my spreadsheet, you have Excel. I can't find a good free public place to host an Excel spreadsheet. Not every engine has 16 valves and 4 cylinders either. Not everyone is concerned with the same factors that I am, and therefore they may have other priorities to consider specific to their engine's build. This video was intended to explain a concept and to show you the process, not how a spreadsheet works. But those of you who want this should watch this on a 4K smart TV or monitor and pause it. Every single thing it takes to make it is actually shown here. Don't forget to also pause it again on my notes when you scroll down. There's good stuff in there too. It's not time consuming to make this, it's just time consuming to make it pretty for a video. And the time it's taken for me to complain about the unfortunate side effect of this file format versus its simplicity, I've actually already tabbed through all the calculated fields, and the FX formula bar up top of the screen has shown every single calculation for every calculated cell. I got complete confidence in your ability to make a spreadsheet that fits your needs if you bought or have access to the kinds of tools that do this kind of thing. But let's be serious, almost nobody does this. When they want this done right, they pay someone to do it. I'm not advertising my services for hire, sorry guys, you're here taking automotive advice from the IT guy. I just wanted you to see how this works. You're seeing me break this down right now and clean my mess up because it's not assembly time yet. All this is going right back in the ice cube trays because this cylinder head needs to be resurfaced before I can use it. I've proven that my parts selections for this head all fit unusually well when properly shuffled, and it just takes me time to do it. It takes a lot of patience and creativity. Sometimes it even takes forgiveness in order to finish this job, but today was not that day. You really only do need to keep it within a few thousandths over your target seat pressure, and you're golden. That should be your goal. This video just proves that it's possible to split the razor's edge of where 85 pounds turns into 86 on every spring and get away with using the same size standard shim on every single intake valve. This is why you spend $1,000 on these tools. And of course, don't forget that $20 pair of offset digital calipers to save yourself hours of struggling with all the math. Like this video so other people like you see it. I won't do a bush resurface on a virgin head that's in this perfect condition. I'd be struck down by lightning if it were such a sin, and this one will be properly shaved by professionals. What? I'll do them a favor and pull these valve stem seals. These were a $13 sacrifice to the gods of speed, and they'll never be forgotten. I have others, it's okay. Tuning the springs to match the same linear seat pressures throughout all their individual travels is no different than a guitarist tuning one of these things by ear, checking all the harmonics on every single string, and finding every single one of them in perfect intonation. Whether we're talking about strings or springs, there's a mechanical aspect to tuning an engine that's much like a musical instrument. So get that right first before you play it. Thank the engineers for the specifications and designs they force us to follow. Thank my Patreons for these kick-ass tools that let me provide these examples and vidges. And subscribe if you're new here because everyone will swear that I won't spam you. I just want to give you something that nobody can take away from you, and I'll let you figure out what that is. But until I manage to do that, stay tubed.